The sun hung low over the Georgia horizon, a bloated red orb bleeding into the sky, casting jagged streaks of crimson across the windshield of Marcus Reynolds' black SUV. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his calloused hands steady, his eyes fixed on the cracked asphalt of State Route 17. At 54, he carried the weight of a soldier's life, decades of barked orders, sleepless nights, and the ghosts of battles fought half a world away. He'd just left a marathon briefing at the Pentagon, his mind still buzzing with troop deployments and classified maps. All he wanted now was the quiet of his porch, a cold drink, and a chance to forget the weight of command. But as the tires hummed against the road, a thought sliced through the haze, sharp and unbidden. I've dodged bullets in Baghdad, but nothing prepares you for the enemy in your own backyard. The rearview mirror flared with sudden light, red and blue, pulsing like a heartbeat gone wild. A patrol car roared up behind him, its siren splitting the evening with a banshee wail. Marcus's jaw tightened. He hadn't sped, hadn't swerved, hadn't so much as rolled through a stop sign. His tags were current, his license clean, his life a testament to discipline. Yet here they were, the flashing lights of familiar predator in the dusk. The loafer blared through the quiet. "Pull over now, or we'll drag you out." The voice was raw, aggressive, a challenge wrapped in authority. Marcus didn't flinch. His right hand flicked the turn signal, precise, deliberate, and he eased the SUV onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch of stones under rubber, a stark counterpoint to the siren's scream. He killed the engine, hands resting at 10 and 2 on the wheel, a habit drilled into him since he was 16. His pulse stayed even, but his eyes, dark, weathered, framed by faint scars, turned cold as steel. The patrol car screeched to a halt behind him, its doors flying open before the dust could settle. Two figures emerged, silhouettes against the dying sun. One short and stocky, a bulldog in a uniform, the other taller, leaner, a shadow with a smirk. Marcus watched them approach in the side mirror, their steps heavy with purpose, their badges glinting like knives. He knew this dance, had lived it too many times. A black man in a nice car, alone on a back road, was a canvas for their assumptions, a target painted in neon. "Hands where I can see 'em!" The shout came from the stocky one, his voice a battering ram against the stillness. He stormed up to the driver's side, flashlight blazing, its beam stabbing into Marcus's eyes. "Out of the car! Now!" The command was laced with venom, the kind that didn't ask, didn't reason. Marcus rolled the window down, slow and steady, letting the cool evening air rush in. It carried the tang of gasoline and the faint rot of the nearby swamp. He met the officer's glare, unflinching, his voice low and measured. "Why was I stopped?" The question hung there, simple but loaded, a gauntlet thrown down in the fading light. The officer's face twisted, a sneer pulling at his lips. "You didn't signal back there. Now move, boy, or we got a problem." The word boy landed like a fist, deliberate, a taunt older than the trees lining the road. Marcus's fingers tightened on the wheel, a flicker of heat sparking in his chest. He'd signaled, perfectly textbook, the way he'd taught his men to do everything by the book. This wasn't about traffic laws. It never was. The taller one stepped closer, his boots crunching gravel, his voice oily with mockery. "Nice ride. Where'd a guy like you get it? Boost it from some rich fool?" The words dripped with contempt, a script Marcus had heard in a dozen towns, a dozen nights. He didn't answer, not yet. His gaze shifted between them, cataloging details. The stocky one's hand hovering over his holster, the taller one's smirk cutting through the dusk like a blade. They thought they had him, cornered, powerless, another easy mark. They had no idea who they'd just pulled over, no clue that the man in their crosshairs could unravel their world with a single call. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the game began. Marcus Reynolds was a man forged in fire. At 54, he stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and solid, his physique a testament to years of discipline and survival. His face bore the lines of a life hard-lived, crow's feet etched deep from squinting into desert suns, a faint scar tracing his left temple from a shrapnel graze in Fallujah. He'd commanded thousands of soldiers across 3 continents, his voice a steady anchor in chaos, his decisions the difference between life and death. 32 years in the U.S. Army had made him a colonel, a strategist, a leader who'd stared down warlords and dictators without blinking. But beneath the calm, beneath the press suit and the Pentagon badge, his soul carried scars no metal could heal. Wounds carved by a nation that demanded his blood but questioned his worth. He wasn't loud, wasn't brash. His strength was quiet, a storm held in check, the kind that didn't need to prove itself until it did. Tonight, as he sat in his SUV, hands on the wheel, he was a coiled spring, controlled, deliberate, every move calculated. He'd learned early that survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about knowing when to wait, when to strike. His eyes, dark and piercing, held a depth that unnerved lesser men, a gaze that saw through facades and straight to the rot beneath. Marcus was a patriot, yes, but not a blind one. He'd served a country that didn't always serve him back, and that truth simmered in his chest, a quiet rage he'd mastered but never tamed. Travis Boone was the opposite, a blunt instrument, a man who wore his malice like a badge of honor. Short and stocky, he carried himself like a pit bull spoiling for a fight. His uniform stretched tight over a barrel chest. His crew cut was buzzed close, his face ruddy from too many beers and too little sleep, his eyes small and mean under a heavy brow. Boone was the kind of cop who thrived on power, the kind who saw his gun and his badge as extensions of his will. He didn't think. He acted, his temper a hair trigger, his fists as quick as his mouth. To him, the world was simple. He was the law, and anyone who crossed him, especially a black man in a car too nice for Boone's liking, was a threat to be crushed. He'd been on the force 12 years, a small-town king in a kingdom of dirt roads and trailer parks. His record was a patchwork of complaints, excessive force, racial slurs, a bar fight swept under the rug, but the system protected its own. Boone didn't question it. He reveled in it. As he stood by Marcus's SUV, flashlight in one hand, the other itching for his holster, he saw not a man, but a stereotype, a chance to flex his authority. "Get out now!" he barked again, his voice a growl, his stance wide and aggressive. He didn't care about reasons or rights. He cared about control, and he'd break bones to keep it. Kyle Grayson was a different beast, taller, leaner, a predator in a sharper suit. At 6'2", he moved with a lazy confidence, his uniform crisp, his blonde hair slicked back under his cap. His face was angular, handsome in a cold way, with pale blue eyes that glinted like ice. Where Boone was a sledgehammer, Grayson was a scalpel, smart, calculating, a manipulator who wielded words as weapons. He didn't need to shout. His smirks and whispers cut deeper than Boone's fists. He'd joined the force 5 years ago, a college dropout with a chip on his shoulder and a knack for bending rules without breaking them. Grayson didn't just enforce the law. He twisted it, played it like a game where he always won. As he circled Marcus's SUV, hands in his pockets, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "He thinks he's a man. Let's remind him he's nothing." The words were a taunt, a probe designed to provoke. Grayson thrived on reactions, on watching his target squirm. He saw Marcus not as a person, but as a puzzle to dismantle, a black man who dared to rise above his place. The contrast was stark. Boone charged in, gun drawn, a bull in a china shop. Grayson hung back smirking, whispering, a snake waiting to strike. Together, they were a perfect storm, brute force and cunning, united by a shared contempt that ran deeper than their badges. The difference played out in seconds. Boone pounded the window again, his flashlight slashing the air. "I said out, boy!" His gun was out now, the barrel glinting under the patrol car's lights, aimed square at Marcus's chest. Grayson leaned against the SUV's hood, arms crossed, his voice a mocking drawl. "What's the holdup, Travis? He's too good to listen." Boone's rage was loud, immediate. Grayson's was cold, patient, a venom that seeped in slow. Marcus sat still, hands visible, his silence a wall they couldn't breach. Not yet. He saw them for what they were, not just men but symptoms, cogs in a machine that had been grinding him down since the day he was born. Boone didn't wait for an answer. "Out! Now!" he roared, yanking the door open with a force that rocked the SUV. The gun stayed steady, its black muzzle a tunnel pointed at Marcus's heart. "Move, or I swear I'll put you down right here." The threat was real, raw, a promise Boone ached to keep. Marcus exhaled, slow and controlled, his hands rising from the wheel, not in surrender, but in strategy. He'd faced worse than this, stared down AK-47s in dusty alleys, but this was different. This was home, and the enemy wore a badge. He stepped out, boots hitting gravel, his frame unfolding to its full height. The evening chill cut through his thin jacket, but he didn't feel it. His eyes locked on Boone's, calm but unyielding, a silent challenge that made the officer's grip tighten on the gun. "Do I have a right to know why?" Marcus asked again, his voice a low rumble, each word deliberate. Boone's face flushed red, his patience snapping. "Because I said so, that's why." He jabbed the barrel forward, close enough for Marcus to smell the oil and metal, a hair's breadth from his chest. "On your knees, now." Grayson moved in, his smirk widening as he circled to the passenger side. "Don't make it hard, man," he said, his tone light, almost playful. "You know how this goes." He kicked the door shut, then leaned in to rummage through the SUV, his hands tearing into the glove box without a warrant, without a care. Papers flew, registration, insurance, a folded letter from the Pentagon, scattering across the seat like confetti. Marcus watched, his jaw clenching, a simmer of rage building beneath his calm. "You're breaking the law," he said, his voice steady but edged with steel. Grayson laughed, a sharp barking sound that echoed off the trees. He pulled out a bronze medal, its ribbon frayed, and held it up like a trophy. "What's this? A toy from the dollar store?" He tossed it onto the dashboard, the clink of metal a deliberate insult. "Nice try, big guy. Where'd you really get this car? Drug run? Welfare scam?" The words were a trap, bait to make Marcus snap, but he didn't bite. Boone stepped closer, his gun still raised, his breath hot and sour. "I said knees, boy. Don't make me say it again." Marcus didn't move. "That's not a lawful order," he said, his tone flat, a fact stated with the weight of 30 years' experience. Boone's eyes bulged, his finger twitching on the trigger. "You don't tell me what's lawful." He swung the gun's butt down, aiming for Marcus's head, but Marcus shifted, just enough, taking the blow on his shoulder. Pain flared, a white-hot spike, but he stayed upright, his stance solid. Grayson clapped, slow and mocking. "Stubborn bastard. He'll kneel eventually." Boone kicked out, his boot slamming into Marcus's back, sending him crashing to one knee. The gravel bit into his skin, sharp and cold, but Marcus's eyes burned, unbowed. "I know who I am," he said, voice steady, a vow carved in stone. Boone laughed, harsh and guttural. "Oh yeah? Who's that? Some nobody we're about to lock up." He stomped to the SUV, joining Grayson in the search, ripping through the center console, tossing a military ID onto the ground without a glance. "Federal employee, huh? Bullshit. You're nothing." Marcus's anger wasn't a flicker now. It was a furnace, roaring in his chest. 30 years defending this country, and I'm still a suspect, he thought, the words a silent detonation in his mind. He'd bled for this nation, buried men for it, carried its flag through hell, and here, on this back road, it meant nothing. Boone and Grayson didn't see a colonel, a veteran, a man. They saw a black face, a threat, a punching bag for their insecurities. Grayson leaned close, his breath warm against Marcus's ear. "Law? We are the law, big man. You're just dirt under our boots." The air thickened, tension coiling tight. Boone grabbed Marcus's arm, yanking him up, the gun still in play. "Talk, or we'll make you," he snarled. Marcus pulled free, staggering but regaining his balance, his voice low and authoritative. "Don't touch me!" Boone's face twisted, and he shoved the barrel into Marcus's chest again. "You dare give orders? Who do you think you are?" Grayson chuckled, stepping back to watch. "He talks about rights, Travis." "Cute." Marcus held Boone's gaze, unflinching. "I'm a citizen who deserves respect." The words were a slap, a line in the sand. Boone's patience shattered. He raised the gun high, bringing the butt down hard on Marcus's shoulder. Again, then again. Pain exploded, but Marcus didn't fall. He staggered, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, but his eyes stayed locked on Boone's, a warrior's defiance. Grayson whistled. "Tough guy. Let's see how long that lasts." They thought they'd won, thought they'd broken him. Boone kicked Marcus's legs out, forcing him face down into the gravel, his cheek scraping against the stones. "Welcome to reality," Grayson whispered, crouching beside him. Marcus turned his head, spitting dust, his voice a growl. "You're breaking the law?" Boone laughed, stomping on Marcus's hand, grinding it into the ground. "Who's gonna stop us? You." The patrol car's lights flashed red and blue, painting the scene in stark relief. 2 cops, 1 man, a power play as old as the South itself. Marcus lay there, bruised but unbroken, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black man stopped, searched, beaten for existing. He'd survived worse, and he'd survived this. But survival wasn't enough. Not tonight. As the gravel pressed into his skin, Marcus's mind slipped back, a reel of memories unspooling in the dark. He was 16, driving his father's beat-up Chevy through Atlanta, the night humid and heavy. Blue lights had flashed then, too, a cop's voice barking through the window. "Hands up, kid!" He'd been on his way to a football game, no record, no trouble. But the officer didn't care. "You look like trouble," the man had said, frisking him against the car, the metal hot against his palms. Marcus had kept his hands on the wheel, his mouth shut, his heart pounding. He'd walked away that night, but the lesson stuck. Innocence didn't matter when your skin was the wrong color. He'd taught his son the same rules years later, sitting him down at 12, voice steady but eyes hard. "Always keep your hands on the wheel, Jamal. Don't argue, don't move fast, don't give him a reason." Jamal had nodded, too young to understand the weight, too old to escape it. Marcus had hoped the military would be different, a meritocracy, a shield. But even there, the slights followed. A white lieutenant questioning his orders, a promotion delayed, whispers of affirmative action behind his back. He'd risen anyway, clawing his way to colonel, proving himself 10 times over. But the road stops never stopped. The suspicion never faded. Lying there, Boone's boot on his back, Marcus saw it clear as day. Boone and Grayson weren't just men. They were products, cogs in a system that thrived on fear and control. "They don't see me," he thought, the realization a blade in his gut. "They see a threat they've been trained to hate." It wasn't personal, not really. It was bigger, older, a machine built on centuries of chains and cotton fields, retooled for badges and body cams. Boone was the muscle, the loud hate that didn't hide. Grayson was the mind, the quiet venom that justified it. Together, they were the system's perfect soldiers, unthinking, unaccountable, unstoppable. His shoulder throbbed, his hand ached, but Marcus's mind was a fortress. He'd faced death in Iraq, watched friends die in Afghanistan, carried their caskets home. This was humiliation, not defeat. He thought of Jamal again, not his son, but his friend, the one who didn't make it. Jamal Carter, shot dead at 19 by a cop who thought he had a gun. A cell phone, it turned out, glinting in the streetlight. Marcus had been overseas then, couldn't save him, couldn't even mourn him properly. That loss had driven him, fueled him, turned him into the man who'd never back down. Not then, not now. Boone's weight shifted, the pressure easing as he stepped back, laughing with Grayson. "Maybe he thinks he's important," Grayson said, kicking dirt onto Marcus's jacket. "Look at him, fancy car, fancy attitude. Bet he's some welfare kingpin." Marcus pushed up, slow and deliberate, ignoring the pain. "I'm a federal employee," he said, voice firm, a fact they couldn't twist. Boone snorted. "Yeah, right. Prove it, liar." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his anger no longer silent. "I've served this country longer than you've been alive," he thought, the words a fire in his throat. "I've buried men better than you'll ever be." He didn't say it, not yet. He let the silence stretch, let them stew in their ignorance. They didn't know about the Pentagon, the medals, the calls he could make. They saw a black man on the ground, and that was enough for them. But Marcus saw more. He saw the rot, the fear behind their bravado, the fragility of their power. They were small, petty, disposable, and he was about to remind them of it. The night closed in, the swamp humming with crickets, the air thick with tension. Marcus's hand twitched toward his pocket, his phone a lifeline he hadn't used yet. Boone noticed, his gun snapping up. "Don't even think about it," he barked. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm making a call," he said, voice calm but ironclad. Grayson laughed, a hyena's cackle. "Go ahead, big shot. Call your mommy. Won't change a thing." They were wrong, dead wrong. And as Marcus's fingers closed around the phone, the first crack appeared in their world, a crack that would widen, deepen, and swallow them whole. The gravel bit into Marcus Reynolds' palms, the cold seeping through his torn jacket as he knelt under the weight of Travis Boone's boot. The patrol car's red and blue lights pulsed like a migraine, casting jagged shadows across the Georgia backroad. Boone's gun hovered inches from Marcus's head, a trembling threat, while Kyle Grayson leaned against the SUV, smirking, his icy eyes glinting with amusement. "Call your mommy," Grayson taunted, his voice a mocking lilt. "Won't change a damn thing." Marcus's fingers tightened around the phone in his pocket, his bruised hand aching but steady. He didn't respond, not with words. His silence was a weapon, a calm that unnerved them more than any shout. He pulled the phone free, slow and deliberate, ignoring Boone's snarl. "Don't you dare!" The officer's gun twitched, but Marcus's gaze never wavered, his eyes locked on Boone's with a soldier's resolve. "I'm making a call," he said, voice low and ironclad, a command wrapped in quiet. Grayson laughed, a sharp, predatory sound, but there was a flicker of unease in his smirk now, a crack in his armor. Marcus dialed a number etched into his memory from decades of service, each digit a lifeline in the dark. The line rang once, only once, before a deep voice answered, cutting through the static with authority. "This is General Nathan Brooks." Across the country, in a windowless room at the Pentagon, Nathan Brooks sat at a polished oak table, surrounded by a dozen uniforms, colonels, majors, a two-star general with a chest full of ribbons. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Maps of the Middle East spread out like a battlefield. Brooks, a barrel-chested man of 60 with silver hair and a voice like gravel, was mid-sentence when his phone buzzed. He frowned, glancing at the screen. Reynolds M., and his jaw tightened. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, rising abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. The room fell silent, eyes tracking him as he stepped into the hall, the door clicking shut behind him. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Marcus?" "General Brooks," Marcus said, his tone softening but firm, a soldier reporting to his commander. "It's Colonel Marcus Reynolds. I'm being detained by 2 local officers on Route 17, Georgia. No cause. They've assaulted me, searched my vehicle without a warrant, and threatened my life." His words were clear, precise, each syllable a bullet fired into the night. Boone's gun wavered, his ruddy face paling, while Grayson's smirk faltered, his arms uncrossing. They couldn't hear the other end, not yet, but Marcus's calm rattled them. Brooks's voice hardened, a storm brewing. "Where are you exactly?" Marcus glanced at the mile marker, 17.3. visible in the patrol car's headlights. "Mile marker 17.3, sir. 2 officers, armed, hostile." Brooks swore under his breath, then barked, "Put me on speaker." Marcus hesitated, his thumb hovering over the button. "Sir." "Do it, Colonel," Brooks snapped, his tone brooking no argument. Marcus pressed the speaker icon, and Brooks's voice boomed into the night, a thunderclap that froze the scene. "This is General Nathan Brooks, U.S. Army, Pentagon. You're dealing with my best man. Let him go, or I'll bury you." The words hit like a shockwave. Boone's gun dropped an inch, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Grayson straightened, his smirk vanishing, replaced by a flicker of panic. The general's voice rolled on, unrelenting. "Names, now." Marcus shifted, pulling himself up to one knee, his phone still raised. He snapped a photo. Boone, red-faced and stammering. Grayson, pale and rigid. Sending it to Brooks with a flick of his thumb. "It's sent, sir," he said, his voice steady, a soldier executing an order. Brooks's reply was a growl. "Travis Boone, Kyle Grayson, you're done. Release Colonel Reynolds immediately, or I'll have federal agents on your asses before sunrise." The line crackled, then went silent. But the echo lingered, a guillotine blade hanging over the 2 officers. Boone stumbled back, his gun lowering, his bravado crumbling. Who the hell is that?" he sputtered, his voice high and shaky. Grayson's eyes darted to Marcus, then to the phone, his mind racing. "He's bluffing," he hissed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Marcus rose, brushing gravel from his jacket, his 6-foot frame towering over Boone, despite the bruises blooming across his shoulder. "He's not," he said, voice cold as steel. "That's the man who can end your careers tonight." He held up his military ID, the gold border catching the light. Colonel Marcus Reynolds, United States Army, Pentagon, and shoved it in Boone's face. "You picked the wrong man." Boone blinked, his small eyes darting between the ID and Marcus, comprehension dawning too late. Grayson swallowed, his hands clenching into fists, but he said nothing. Not yet. The power had shifted, and the night trembled with it. As Boone and Grayson stood frozen, Marcus's mind slipped back, the pain in his body a tether to memories he'd buried deep. He was 8 years old, crouched behind a rusted chain-link fence in a Chicago slum, the air thick with the stench of garbage and despair. His father, James Reynolds, stood in the alley, hands raised, a white cop's baton cracking against his ribs. "Stay down, boy," the officer snarled, his voice a whip, his uniform pristine against the grime. James, a wiry man with calloused hands from the steel mill, didn't fight back. He couldn't, not with Marcus watching, not with the rent due and a family to feed. The cop walked away laughing, leaving James crumpled in the dirt, blood trickling from his lip. Marcus had run to him, small hands tugging at his father's sleeve. "Why'd he do that, Daddy?" James wiped his mouth, eyes hollow. "Because he can, son. Because he can." That night, Marcus made a vow, silent, childish, but ironclad. He'd rise above it, change it, break the system that broke men like his father. At 18, he'd enlisted, trading the slum for boot camp, the baton for a rifle. The Army promised order, merit, a way out. He'd believed it then, believed he could rewrite the rules from the inside. But the system didn't bend. It hid. Fort Bragg, 1995. Marcus, a young sergeant, stood at attention as a white lieutenant sneered, "You only got this post 'cause they needed a quota." The words stung, but Marcus swallowed them, outworked them, outfought them. He climbed, lieutenant, captain, major, each rank a battle won, each promotion a scar earned. Iraq, 2004. He led a platoon through Fallujah, bullets pinging off Humvees, his calm voice pulling men from panic to victory. Afghanistan, 2011. He took shrapnel saving a private, earned a Bronze Star, and still came home to whispers of lucky break from men who'd never seen a war zone. The deepest cut wasn't the Army, though. It was home. Jamal Carter, his childhood friend, his brother in all but blood, haunted him still. They'd grown up together, two skinny kids dodging trouble in the projects. Jamal was the dreamer, always sketching in notebooks, talking about art school. Marcus was the fighter, the one who dragged Jamal out of scraps. At 19, they'd drifted. Marcus to basic training, Jamal to a job at a corner store. Then the call came, 1990, a crackling line from his mother. "Jamal's gone, Marcus. Cops shot him, said he had a gun. It was a damn phone." He'd been in Germany, couldn't get back for the funeral. The details trickled in later. Jamal, walking home, stopped by a patrol car. A rookie cop, twitchy, yelling. Jamal reached for his pocket, his phone, to call his girl, and the cop fired. 4 shots, chest and head, dead before he hit the pavement. "Mistaken identity," the report said. Tragic error. No charges, no justice, just a folded flag and a mother's wail. Marcus had stood over Jamal's grave a year later, rain soaking his uniform, and swore, "I'll make it mean something. I'll rise so high they can't touch us." That vow drove him, through ranks, through wars, through nights like this. Now, on Route 17, with Boone's boot print on his back and Grayson's taunts in his ears, Jamal's face flashed before him. He'd risen, yes, Colonel, Pentagon, a voice that could summon generals, but the system hadn't changed. It wore a different mask, badges instead of batons, smirks instead of slurs, but the core was the same. Power, unchecked, aimed at men like him, like Jamal, like his father. Marcus clenched his fists, the pain grounding him. He wasn't just fighting for himself tonight. He was fighting for them all. Brooks's voice still echoed in the air, a death knell for Boone and Grayson's arrogance. Boone stumbled back, his gun clattering to his side, his ruddy face drained of color. What the hell just happened?" he stammered, his voice cracking, a bully stripped bare. He turned to Grayson, eyes wild. "He's some Army hotshot? We're screwed, Kyle." His hands shook, the gun dangling uselessly, his bravado dissolving into panic. He paced, boots kicking gravel, muttering to himself. "I didn't sign up for this. I just wanted him to move, that's all. We can fix this, right? Grayson didn't answer right away. He stood rigid, his pale eyes narrowed, his mind spinning like a chess player down a piece. "Calm down, Travis," he said finally, voice low and tight, a snake coiling for a strike. "He's not untouchable. We can spin this." He stepped closer to Boone, grabbing his arm, forcing him to stop. "Say he resisted. Say he swung at you first. We've got the badges. They'll believe us." His tone was cold, calculating, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Boone blinked, grasping at it. Yeah, resisting arrest. That's it. He wouldn't get out, right? Marcus watched them, rising to his feet, his shadow long in the flashing lights. "You're digging your graves," he said, voice a quiet thunder. Boone flinched, but Grayson turned, his smirk creeping back, a mask of control. "Graves? You think one call changes everything? This is our turf, Colonel." He spat the title like a curse, stepping forward, closing the gap. "You're still just a black man in the wrong place. We've handled worse." The conflict split them, Boone crumbling, Grayson doubling down. Boone ran a hand over his buzzed head, sweat beading on his brow. "Kyle, he's got the Pentagon. We can't fight that." Grayson wheeled on him, eyes flashing. "Shut up, Travis. We fight or we run, and I'm not running." He jabbed a finger at Marcus. "He's bluffing. No general's gonna waste time on this. We stick to the story, resisting, threatening an officer, our word against his." Marcus held his ground, blood trickling from his brow, his ID still in hand. "Your cameras," he said, nodding at the body cams clipped to their chests. "They've got it all. Every word, every hit." Boone froze, his hand flying to his chest, feeling the device. "Oh God," he whispered, realization crashing in. Grayson's face tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Cameras glitch," he said, voice smooth. "Tech fails. Happens all the time." He was grasping now, but his confidence held, a manipulator refusing to fold. Boone sank to a crouch, head in his hands. "I just wanted him out of the car," he muttered, a broken record. I didn't know." Grayson kicked him, sharp and quick. "Get up, you idiot, we're not done." He turned back to Marcus, eyes blazing. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Marcus met his stare, unflinching. "It's over when I say it is." The standoff stretched, a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Boone wanted out. Grayson wanted war, and Marcus stood between them, a rock they couldn't move. The night thickened, the swamps hum a low chorus to the standoff. Marcus straightened, wiping blood from his eye, his gaze piercing Grayson. "You don't hate me because I'm black," he said, voice cutting through the silence. "You hate me because I'm black and better than you." The words landed like a grenade, raw and true, stripping Grayson's smirk bare. For a moment, the officer said nothing, his pale face a mask. Then he laughed, a cold, brittle sound, and stepped closer, boots crunching gravel. "Better?" Grayson said, his voice dripping venom. "This country wasn't built for you to rise, Colonel. It was built by us, for us. You're a glitch, a mistake we're here to fix." The words were a manifesto, a creed whispered in locker rooms and bar rooms, handed down through generations. Grayson didn't just enforce the law, he believed it bent to him, to men like him, white and untouchable. Marcus held his gaze, unflinching. "It's not your country," he said. "It's mine too. I've bled for it, more than you ever will." Grayson's eyes narrowed, his mask slipping, revealing the rot beneath. "Blood doesn't make you equal," he spat. "You're still nothing, badge or no badge." It was personal now, a clash of worlds. Marcus, the soldier who'd earned his place, and Grayson, the gatekeeper who'd inherited his. Boone watched, mute and trembling, a pawn caught between kings. Marcus stepped forward, closing the gap, his voice low but seismic. "You're scared, Grayson, scared of a world where I don't bow." The officer flinched, a crack in his armor, but he rallied. "Scared? I'm the one with the gun, the badge, the power. You're just a number, another stop, another file." Marcus's mind flashed, a report he'd read at the Pentagon, buried in a stack of classified briefs. 12,000 black drivers stopped without cause in Georgia last year alone. 300 escalated to violence. 47 dead. The numbers were cold, clinical, but each one was a face. Jamal, his father, countless others. "A number?" Marcus said. "I'm the one you'll remember." Grayson's laugh died, his face twisting. "You're a threat. That's all I see. Always will be." It was the heart of it, the root Marcus had fought his whole life. Not just hate, but fear, ingrained so deep it was instinct. Boone and Grayson weren't outliers. They were the system's foot soldiers, trained to see black skin as a weapon, a challenge to their fragile order. Marcus thought of the stats again, the lives reduced to ink on a page, and his anger flared, not loud, but deep. A furnace stoked by decades of watching the same play unfold. "You're not wrong," he said, voice steady. "I am a threat. To you, to this. Because I won't kneel, won't break, won't let you win." Grayson's hand twitched toward his gun, but he stopped, Brooks's threat echoing in his mind. Marcus pressed on. "You think this is power? It's cowardice. You hide behind badges because without them, you're nothing." The words cut, and Grayson's facade cracked, his voice rising. "Nothing? I'll show you nothing. Right here, right now." Boone grabbed his arm, desperate. "Kyle, stop! He's got the general." Grayson shook him off, eyes wild. "Let him call. Let the feds come. I'll take them all down with me." It was unraveling, Grayson's control slipping, his hate boiling over. Marcus stood tall, bloodied but unbroken, a mirror to their fragility. Racism wasn't just their weapon. It was their weakness, a crutch they leaned on because they couldn't stand alone. And Marcus, with his scars and his rank and his unyielding will, was the reckoning they'd never seen coming. The Georgia night trembled as General Nathan Brooks's voice faded from Marcus Reynolds' phone, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against the skin. Travis Boone stood slack-jawed, his gun dangling at his side, sweat beading on his ruddy face. Kyle Grayson's smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl, his pale eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Marcus rose to his full height, brushing gravel from his bloodied hands, his military ID glinting in the patrol car's flashing lights. The power had shifted, a tectonic jolt they couldn't undo, and the air crackled with the promise of reckoning. Then came the sirens, sharp, insistent, slicing through the swamp's hum. A black sedan screeched onto Route 17, dust swirling in its wake, followed by an unmarked van. Doors flew open, and Chief Daniel Pierce stepped out, his broad frame filling the space, his badge gleaming under a crisp uniform. At 58, Pierce was a veteran of the force, his graying hair cropped short, his face etched with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much but buried it deeper. Behind him, 2 internal affairs officers emerged, stone-faced, suits pressed, their presence a silent threat. Pierce's sharp gaze swept the scene. Marcus, bruised but unbowed, Boone, a trembling mess. Grayson, rigid with defiance. "What the hell did you do?" Pierce growled, his voice low but cutting, aimed at Boone and Grayson. Boone stammered, his hands flailing. "Chief, it was a mistake. We didn't know who he was." Pierce's eyes narrowed, flicking to Marcus's ID, Colonel Marcus Reynolds, U.S. Army, Pentagon, and back to his officers. "You don't need to know who he is to follow the damn law," he snapped, but there was a strain in his tone, a flicker of something calculated. Pierce wasn't here to save Marcus. He was here to save the department. Grayson stepped forward, chin high, his voice a blade. "You think this ends with us, Chief? The whole damn force is like this, top to bottom." The words exploded into the night, a grenade lobbed at Pierce's feet. Boone flinched, but Grayson pressed on, eyes blazing. "We're just the ones who got caught. You gonna pretend you don't know?" Pierce's face darkened, a muscle twitching in his jaw, but he didn't respond. Not yet. He turned to Marcus, his tone softening, a politician's pivot. "Colonel Reynolds, I apologize for this. We'll handle it internally." Marcus didn't blink. "Handle it?" he said, voice cold as steel. "You mean bury it?" He gestured at Boone and Grayson, then at the body cams blinking on their chests. "It's all there, assault, threats, racism. You can't sweep this under the rug." Pierce's lips thinned, his hands clenching into fists. He wasn't a saint. Marcus saw it in the way his eyes darted, the way he squared his shoulders. Pierce wanted control, not justice. A clean slate for a department already stained with whispers of brutality. "We'll investigate," Pierce said, voice tight. "You have my word." "Your word means nothing," Marcus shot back, stepping closer, his 6-foot frame, a wall Pierce couldn't bypass. "I want them gone, cuffed, charged, finished." Boone whimpered, sinking to his knees, but Grayson laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. Gone? You think that fixes anything? This is bigger than us, Colonel. You're a fool if you think otherwise. Pierce signaled the IA officers, who moved in with cuffs, their movements swift and mechanical. Boone didn't resist, his head bowed, muttering, I'm sorry. Grayson fought, twisting against the metal, his voice rising. You're all blind. This force runs on us, on men like me. The cuffs clicked shut, and Pierce turned back to Marcus, his expression a mix of fury and fatigue. They're suspended, effective now, he said, but his eyes betrayed him, shifty, guarded, a man playing defense. We'll review the footage, file a report. This doesn't need to escalate. Marcus held his gaze, unflinching. It's already escalated. You're not cleaning this up, you're covering it. Pierce bristled, but before he could reply, Grayson shouted from the van, his voice echoing off the trees. You'll see, Chief. You can't stop what's coming. The threat hung there, a promise of chaos. And Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The internal affairs van peeled away, Boone and Grayson's silhouettes fading into the night. But the tension didn't dissipate. It thickened, a storm brewing on the horizon. Pierce lingered, his sedan idling, his radio crackling with static. Marcus stood by his SUV, blood drying on his brow, his mind racing. He'd won a battle, but the war was just starting. Then came the roar of engines. 2 black SUVs, federal plates, tearing down Route 17 like hounds on a scent. They screeched to a halt, dust swirling, and 4 agents stepped out. Suits crisp, badges flashing. FBI. The lead agent, a wiry woman with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense stare, approached Marcus. Colonel Reynolds, she said, voice clipped. Agent Laura Hensley, FBI Civil Rights Division. General Brooks sent us. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. Good. You've got work to do. Hensley's eyes flicked to Pierce, then back to Marcus. We've got more than that. This isn't just about tonight. We've been tracking this department for years. Cover-ups, beatings, deaths, all buried. Your call cracked it open. Pierce stiffened, his face paling. What the hell are you talking about? He demanded, stepping forward, but Hensley ignored him, pulling a tablet from her jacket. She swiped, revealing a dossier, photos, reports, names. 17 complaints of excessive force in the last 5 years, all dismissed. 9 black men dead in custody, ruled accidental. A dozen officers linked to a pattern of stops like yours, Colonel, all unreported. She turned the screen to Marcus, a grainy photo of Boone and Grayson at a bar, laughing with a group of uniforms, a Confederate flag on the wall. This is a network, not a couple of bad apples. Marcus's stomach churned, the numbers echoing the report he'd read. 12,000 stops, 300 violent, 47 dead. But this was worse, a web of rot stretching across the county. How deep? He asked, voice low. Hensley met his gaze, unflinching. Deep enough to take down the whole force. We need you as a witness. Your rank, your record, it's leverage. Marcus shook his head, his voice firm. I'm not your poster boy. I want the system gone, torn out, root and stem. No reforms, no half measures. Pierce intervened, his tone sharp. You're overreacting, Colonel. We can fix this internally. Like you fixed it for years? Marcus cut him off, stepping into Pierce's space. You knew, didn't you? Knew and let it fester. Pierce's eyes flashed, but he didn't deny it. Hensley stepped between them, her voice cold. Chief, you're a person of interest now. Step back. Pierce glared, but complied, retreating to his sedan, his radio buzzing with urgent chatter. The feds set up a perimeter, agents pulling files from the van, boxes of evidence, years of silence breaking open. Hensley briefed Marcus. A whistleblower, a retired deputy, had leaked records 2 years ago. Beatings taped over, witnesses intimidated, families paid off. Boone and Grayson were foot soldiers, but the orders came higher. Lieutenants, captains, maybe Pierce himself. We've got body cam footage from tonight, Hensley said, nodding at a text syncing the data. It's damning. Assault, racial slurs, threats. They're done, but we're going wider. Marcus listened, his mind a battlefield. He saw Jamal's face, his father's crumpled form, every stop he'd endured, each a thread in this tapestry of abuse. Wider how? He asked. Hensley's jaw tightened. Raids, arrests, a federal probe. This department's a cancer. We're cutting it out. Marcus nodded, but his eyes were hard. Cut deeper. It's not just here. It's everywhere. Hensley studied him, then nodded. We'll see, but you're the spark, Colonel. They can't ignore you. Pierce watched from his car, his face a mask of fury and fear, knowing his empire was crumbling. The feds moved fast. Warrants issued, calls made, a machine grinding into motion. Marcus stood apart, bloodied but resolute, a soldier in a new war. He wasn't their symbol, he was their weapon, and he'd see this through to the end. 2 hours later, Boone and Grayson sat in a holding cell at the county jail, the clang of bars a grim soundtrack. Boone slumped on a bench, head in his hands, muttering, "We're done, Kyle, done." Grayson paced, his lean frame taut, his mind racing. "Not yet," he snapped, pulling a burner phone from his sock, a cheap flip model smuggled in by a sympathetic guard. He dialed, his voice low and urgent. "It's Grayson. They've got us. Feds, IA, the works. Reynolds ratted us out. We need to hit back, hard." On the other end, a gruff voice answered. Sergeant Mike Dillard, a burly veteran with a rap sheet scrubbed clean by favors. "What's the play?" he asked, his tone cold. Grayson's eyes glinted. "Take him out. Reynolds, make it look like a random hit. Roadside, quick. Teach him not to mess with us." Dillard grunted. "Risky. Feds are all over this." Grayson smirked, a predator's grin. "That's why it's gotta be now, before they lock it down. You've got the crew. Do it." Dillard hung up, rounding up 3 officers, loyal, dirty, itching for a fight. They met at a gas station off Highway 75, piling into an unmarked pickup, rifles stashed under a tarp. The plan was simple. Tail Marcus, wait for a stretch of empty road, and open fire. "He's a soldier," Dillard warned, loading a shotgun. "Won't go easy?" The driver, a wiry kid named Hayes, grinned. "Good, more fun." Marcus, meanwhile, drove north on 75, his SUV humming through the night, the feds' words ringing in his ears. He'd refused their escort, needed air, space to think, but his instincts, honed by war, prickled. The rearview mirror flashed, headlights, too close, too steady. He shifted lanes, they followed. His pulse quickened, hands tightening on the wheel. "Ambush," he muttered, a soldier's gut kicking in. He floored it, the SUV surging, but the pickup matched him, closing fast. Gunfire erupted, sharp cracks splitting the night, bullets pinging off the SUV's rear. Marcus swerved, glass shattering as a round punched through the back window. He ducked, steering with one hand, the other reaching for his Glock, kept in the console, a habit from deployments. The pickup roared alongside, Hayes leaning out, spraying rounds from an AR-15. Marcus jerked the wheel, sideswiping them, metal screeching. The truck spun, but righted itself. Dillard's shotgun blasting, shredding a tire. The SUV fishtailed, rubber flapping, but Marcus kept control, years of evasive driving snapping into play. He aimed the Glock out the window, firing. 2 shots, precise, one shattering the pickup's windshield, the other hitting Hayes in the shoulder. The kid screamed, dropping the rifle, and the truck veered. Marcus didn't stop, slammed the gas, weaving through traffic, losing them in a maze of backroads. He pulled into a ditch, engine smoking, and checked himself. Cuts, bruises, alive. His phone buzzed. Hensley. "Colonel, you okay? We've got reports of shots on 75. Marcus's voice was steel. "They came for me. Your done officers have friends." Hensley swore. "We're on it. Stay put." Marcus didn't. He climbed out, Glock in hand, scanning the dark. Grayson's voice echoed in his mind. "This isn't over?" It wasn't. They'd failed, but they'd try again, unless he ended it first. Alone in the ditch, the wrecked SUV ticking as it cooled, Marcus leaned against a tree, his breath steady despite the adrenaline. The night was a void, stars hidden by clouds, the swamp's chorus a distant hum. His shoulder throbbed, his hand bled, but his mind was clear. A battlefield of questions he'd dodged too long. Can this system be fixed, or does it need to burn? He'd spent 32 years serving it, believing in its promise, order, justice, a nation worth dying for. Tonight, that belief cracked, a fault line running through his soul. He thought of his men, black soldiers under his command, faces flashing like ghosts. Private Jackson, 22, killed by an IED in Kandahar, his laugh still echoing in Marcus's ears. Sergeant Lewis, a father of 3, who'd confessed over whiskey, "I fight for this country, sir, but it don't fight for me." They'd trusted him, followed him, died for a flag that waved over stops like this, over graves like Jamal's. Marcus had risen for them, climbed to colonel to prove they could, prove he could. But what had it changed? Boone's boot, Grayson's smirk, a pickup full of bullets. The system didn't bend, it struck back. He slid down the tree, Glock resting on his knee, and stared into the dark. Reform was a word he'd heard too often. Politicians' promises, Pentagon briefings, empty noise. Pierce wanted reform, Hensley too. New rules, better training, a polished facade. But Marcus saw deeper. A machine built on bones, oiled with blood, its gears grinding men like him into dust. "Fix it," he muttered, voice rough. "You don't fix cancer, you cut it out." The thought was treason to the soldier in him, loyalty a chain he'd worn proudly. Yet here, battered and hunted, it felt true. Jamal's death replayed. 4 shots, a cell phone mistaken for a gun, a life erased. His father's beating, the cop's laugh, a baton's crack. His own scars, every stop, every slur, every sidelong glance in uniform. They weren't exceptions. They were the rule, a pattern etched into the nation's marrow. Marcus thought of Lewis again, his words a knife. "It don't fight for me." He'd answered then, "We make it fight." But now he wondered, could it? Or was it a beast that fed on its own, spitting out men like Boone and Grayson to guard its gates? He stood wincing, the Glock heavy in his hand. He could walk away, retire, fade into quiet, let the feds clean up. But that wasn't him. He'd fought in wars, faced death, carried the fallen home. This was a war too, not overseas, but here, in the shadows of his own land. "They don't get to win," he said, voice a vow. Not Boone, not Grayson, not the system that birthed them. He'd tear it down, not for reform, but for ruin, for a chance at something new. The feds were coming, but Marcus wasn't waiting. He'd survive their bullets tonight. Tomorrow, he'd fire back. The sun rose over the small Georgia town of Millwood, its light filtering through the pines, casting long shadows across the cracked streets. The air buzzed with unrest, a hum that had started the moment word of Marcus Reynolds' confrontation spread. By noon, the town square, a dusty patch flanked by a courthouse and a shuttered diner, was alive with voices. A sea of black faces gathered in defiance. Men and women, young and old, stood shoulder to shoulder, their signs scrawled with Sharpie. "No more stops, justice for us, end the badge terror." The news of Marcus, a colonel, a soldier, beaten and hunted by their own police, had lit a match, and the dry tinder of their pain caught fire. At the center stood Evelyn Carter, 72, her gray hair pulled tight under a faded scarf, her hands trembling as she gripped a megaphone. Her voice cracked but carried, raw with grief. "My son didn't have a general to call," she said, tears streaking her weathered face. "He was 23, walking home from work, and they shot him. Said he looked suspicious. He's gone, and they're still here, wearing badges like it's a crown." The crowd murmured, a wave of anger and sorrow rippling through them. Evelyn raised a photo, her son, Terrence, smiling in a graduation cap, and her voice broke. "Marcus lived, my boy didn't. How many more?" The stories poured out, a flood breaching a dam too long ignored. A mechanic, James Hill, stepped up, his voice steady, but eyes hard. "They stopped me last year, 3 times in a month. No tickets, just fists. Broke my nose, 'cause I asked why." A young mother, Tasha Green, clutched her toddler, her words sharp. "My brother got pulled over for a taillight, ended up in a coma. They called it resisting. He was unarmed." Hundreds more echoed. Stops, beatings, threats. A litany of abuse stretching back decades, each tale a mirror to Marcus's night on Route 17. By afternoon, the crowd swelled, 500, then 1,000, spilling onto the courthouse steps. News vans rolled in, cameras flashing, reporters thrusting microphones into faces. Colonel Reynolds, a decorated veteran, assaulted by local police? "What does this mean for Millwood?" one asked, her tone clipped. The question hung, unanswered, until a teenage boy, Malik, shouted, "It means they can't hide no more." Cheers erupted, fists raised, a chant rising. No justice, no peace. Marcus, still bruised and bandaged from the highway ambush, watched from the edge, his SUV parked nearby. He hadn't sought this, didn't want the spotlight, but it found him, relentless. The media latched on, his face plastered across screens. Hero Colonel exposes police brutality. Pentagon powerhouse fights back. CNN ran a segment, a pundit calling him a symbol of resistance. Fox spun it, questioning his compliance. Marcus turned off the TV in his motel room, jaw tight. He wasn't a symbol, he was a man, flesh and blood, tired of being a target. But the town saw him differently. Kids taped his photo to protest signs. Elders whispered his name like a prayer. Evelyn approached him that evening, her eyes red but fierce. "You gave us a voice, Colonel. Don't walk away now." He met her gaze, seeing Jamal in her son's photo, his father in her pain. "I'm not walking," he said, voice low. "But this isn't about me. It's about you, all of you." She nodded, gripping his hand, and the weight settled heavier on his shoulders. The protests grew, marches down Main Street, vigils at the jail where Boone and Grayson sat. The feds watched, Agent Hensley noting names, but the community didn't care. They'd been silent too long, and Marcus's survival was their spark, a black man who'd faced the beast and walked away. The town trembled, a powder keg lit, and the world was watching. In the county jail, Kyle Grayson sat in a cell, his lean frame coiled like a spring, his pale eyes fixed on the wall. Travis Boone slumped across from him, a broken heap, muttering apologies to no one. The feds had torn through the department, raids, arrests, files seized. But Grayson wasn't done. His burner phone was gone, confiscated after the ambush failed, but his mind churned, plotting. He'd underestimated Marcus, but he wouldn't again. Then came the knock. Agent Hensley, flanked by 2 suits, her tablet glowing with new evidence. "Grayson," she said, voice cold as ice. "You're not just a cop gone bad. You're a soldier in a different war." She slid a photo across the table, a grainy shot of Grayson at a rural compound, arm around a man in a camo jacket, a swastika tattoo peeking from his sleeve. "The Sons of Liberty," Hensley continued, tapping the screen. "White supremacist militia, active since '98. You've been a member for 7 years, recruiting, training, pulling strings in the force." Grayson's lips twitched, a ghost of a smirk, but he stayed silent. Hensley leaned in, her stare unyielding. "Boone was your puppet, loud, dumb, easy to control. You're the brains, the one who turned this department into your playground." She swiped, emails, texts, a ledger of payoffs. "You rigged stops, planted evidence, silenced witnesses. That ambush on Reynolds. Your idea, your orders. Dillard sang like a bird, gave us everything." Grayson's smirk faded, his hands clenching. "Prove it," he said, voice low, a dare. She did. Another swipe, audio from a tapped call, Grayson's voice clear. "Take him out. Make it quick. Photos of the compound, rifles, manifestos, a list of targets." Marcus's name circled in red. "You're not just a racist cop," Hensley said. "You're a terrorist, running a cell inside the badge." Boone's head snapped up, eyes wide. "What? Kyle, what the hell?" Grayson ignored him, staring at Hensley. "You think this stops me? I'm one of many. Cut me down, another rises." The truth unspooled, a thread pulled from a rotting tapestry. Grayson had joined the force not to serve, but to subvert. A mole for a cause that saw black lives as threats to their America. He'd handpicked Boone, brutal but pliable, building a network of loyalists. Dillard, Hayes, a dozen others now in cuffs. They'd targeted black drivers, staged incidents, buried complaints with Pierce's tacit nod. The Sons of Liberty funded it. Cash for guns, alibis, silence. Marcus's stop wasn't random. It was a test, a flex of power Grayson thought he'd win. Hensley briefed Marcus that night, her motel room a warren of files. "He's the tip of the iceberg," she said, handing him a dossier. "We've linked him to 3 other departments. Same pattern, same hate. This goes national." Marcus flipped through, photos of Grayson at rallies, a manifesto ranting about purity, a kill list with Jamal's name scratched out, years too late. His stomach twisted, rage simmering. "He's not just a cop," Marcus said, voice rough. "He's a cancer, spreading, killing." Hensley nodded. "We're charging him. Conspiracy, attempted murder, civil rights violations. Boone's a minnow. Grayson's the shark. But he's right about one thing. He's not alone." Marcus met her gaze, his eyes hard. "Then we hunt them all." The revelation shifted everything. Grayson wasn't a rogue. He was a cog in a machine bigger than Millwood, a shadow war Marcus had stumbled into. Boone was a tool, Grayson the architect, and the system their shield, until now. The next morning, Marcus stood in the motel parking lot, the air thick with humidity, his Glock holstered under his jacket. Agent Hensley approached, her face grim but resolute. "Colonel," she said, "we've got an offer. The DOJ wants you as a consultant. Help us reform this mess. Train new oversight. Make it stick. Your voice carries weight." Pierce had called too, voice oily over the phone. "Work with us, Reynolds. We'll clean house, start fresh. You can be the face of change." Marcus stared at the horizon, the town's protests a distant roar. Reform. The word tasted like ash. He'd heard it before, after Jamal, after every headline, every march. New policies, more cameras, promises that faded when the cameras left. "I won't polish a broken machine," he said, voice firm, turning to Hensley. "You want me to patch it up, make it look good? It's not fixable. It's rotten, built that way." Hensley frowned but didn't argue. "Then, what's your play?" she asked. He thought of Evelyn's tears, James's broken nose, Tasha's brother, Liv's crushed by a system that didn't bend, only broke. Reform was a bandage on a severed limb. He wanted surgery, amputation, a new start. "I'm done with your game," he said. "I'll build my own." He walked away, leaving Hensley silent, and drove to the square. The crowd parted as he approached, eyes on him, hopeful, wary, waiting. He took Evelyn's megaphone, his voice steady, cutting through the noise. "I'm not your hero," he said, "but I'm not leaving you. We can't wait for them to fix this. They won't. We protect ourselves, our streets, our kids, our lives." Murmurs rose, then cheers. He outlined it, simple, raw, a community watch, trained, armed if needed, a shield against badges gone bad. "No more begging," he said. "We stand up together." Evelyn nodded, tears gone, resolve in her eyes. Malik grinned, fist raised. The idea took root, rough, unpolished, a rebellion born of necessity. Hensley watched from a distance, radio crackling with updates, Grayson's charges, Pierce's suspension, but Marcus's words echoed louder. He wasn't naive. He knew the risks, vigilantism charges, pushback, blood, but he'd led men into war, faced death, built order from chaos. This was his unit now, not soldiers, but survivors, and he'd trained them like he'd trained his platoon, hard, smart, unbreakable. "I won't be your face," he told Pierce later, voice cold over the line. "I'll be your reckoning." He hung up, the choice made, not reform, but revolution, a line drawn in Millwood's dust. Days later, Marcus sat in a diner, nursing coffee, the TV blaring Grayson's arraignment, handcuffs, no bail, a snarl on his face. A letter slid across the counter, delivered by a nervous waitress. "From the jail," she muttered, retreating. Marcus opened it, Boone's scrawl, shaky and misspelled. "Colonel Reynolds, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Please forgive me." The name was wrong, the plea pathetic, ink smudged with sweat. Marcus laughed, a dry, bitter sound, dark humor cutting through the ache. "Even their apologies are half-assed," he said, tossing it aside, the absurdity a brief relief. The tension didn't ease, though. Grayson's crew, Dillard, Hayes, others, were in custody, but whispers grew. Loyalists still out there, plotting. Marcus felt it, eyes on him in the diner, a truck lingering too long outside. Hensley called, voice tight. "We've got chatter. Sons of Liberty aren't done. They're targeting you, the protests." Marcus gripped his Glock, the weight familiar. "Let 'em try," he said, voice steel. "I've faced worse." That night, a brick crashed through his motel window, glass shattering, a note tied with twine. "You're next, traitor." Marcus didn't flinch, swept the glass, taped the hole, slept with the Glock by his side. The next day, Boone's cellmate leaked a story. Boone, sobbing, offering to testify for a deal, misspelling Marcus's name again in a plea to the feds. Reynolds, he'd written, and Marcus smirked, the incompetence a grim joke amid the threat. The protests swelled, clashes brewing, cops in riot gear, marchers with bats. Marcus trained his watch, 10 men and women, Evelyn among them, learning to spot tails, dodge traps. They'll come, he warned, voice low, and we'll be ready. The humor faded, tension coiling tight, a town on the brink. Boone's letter sat crumpled on the table, a relic of a fool. Grayson's shadow loomed larger, a ghost Marcus would face, laughing or not, when the time came. The air in Millwood hung heavy, thick with the scent of rain and unrest, as Marcus Reynolds stood in the motel parking lot, his Glock holstered, his bruised hands steady. A week had passed since the protests ignited, since Grayson's white supremacist ties unraveled and Boone's pitiful apologies landed like bad jokes. The feds had swept through, arrests, resignations, a department gutted, but Marcus felt no victory, only a gnawing unease. The system was cracking but not breaking, and the shadows lingered, whispering threats. Then came the envelope, slipped under his door at dawn, unmarked, its edges worn. Inside, a single page, photocopied, stamped, classified in red ink, a military report dated 2007 from Fort Bragg. Marcus's breath caught as he read. Incident: military police assault on civilian, 12-14-07. Victim: Darius Hill, 19, black male. Outcome: death by blunt force trauma. Officer: Lieutenant Thomas Grady, disposition, case closed, no charges, supervising. Officer: Major Nathan Brooks. A handwritten note scrawled at the bottom. He buried it. Ask him. Marcus's heart pounded, the paper trembling in his grip. Nathan Brooks, his mentor, his savior, the general who'd roared through the phone to save him on Route 17, had covered up a killing. He saw Jamal in Darius's name, his father in the brutality, himself in the betrayal. The words blurred, rage and disbelief colliding. Brooks had called him his best man, pulled strings to crush Boone and Grayson. But this was a dagger in the spine, a truth that rewrote everything. He drove to Atlanta, the 2-hour stretch a blur of asphalt and memory, the report burning a hole in his passenger seat. Brooks's office was a sleek suite in a downtown high-rise, a retirement perch after the Pentagon, glass walls, a view of the city, a shrine to his decorated career. Marcus stormed in, past a startled secretary, slamming the door behind him. Brooks stood at his desk, silver hair glinting, his broad frame still commanding despite the civilian suit. "Marcus," he said, voice warm, then faltering as he saw the fire in his colonel's eyes. "What's this?" Marcus threw the report down, the paper slapping the wood. "Explain it," he said, voice low, a growl barely contained. Brooks glanced at it, his face tightening, but he didn't flinch. "Where did you get this?" he asked, stalling. Marcus stepped closer, towering over the desk. "Doesn't matter. Darius Hill, 19, beaten to death by your MP. You signed off, buried it. Why?" Brooks sank into his chair, hands folding, his silence a confession. "It was a mess," he said finally, voice rough. "Grady lost control. Kid mouthed off. Things escalated. I had a choice. Ruin a career or contain it. I contained it." Marcus's fists clenched, nails biting his palms. "Contain it? You let a murderer walk? You damned a family, damn me, to keep your stars." Brooks's eyes flashed, a spark of the old general. "I saved you, didn't I? That night on 17, I moved mountains for you. You saved me because I mattered to you," Marcus shot back, voice rising. "Darius didn't. He was just another black kid, expendable. You're no better than Grayson. Same game, different uniform." Brooks recoiled, the comparison a slap, but he rallied, standing. "I built a career to protect men like you, gave you a path up. One mistake doesn't erase that." Marcus leaned in, eyes blazing. "One mistake? It's a life, Nathan. And how many more? How many did you bury to climb?" The room crackled, a standoff between mentor and protege, loyalty and truth at war. Brooks's jaw worked, then he sighed, deflating. "I don't know," he admitted, voice hollow. "It was the system. Eat or be eaten. I chose to eat." Marcus shook his head, disgust curling his lip. "Then you're done. Resign, today, or I take this public. Every newsroom, every march, every grave like Darius's. You don't get to hide anymore." Brooks stared, the weight of decades pressing down, then nodded. A slow, broken surrender. "All right," he said, voice barely audible. "I'll go." Marcus didn't wait for more. Turned, walked out, the door slamming behind him. By nightfall, Brooks's resignation hit the wires. General Nathan Brooks steps down amid health concerns. A lie, but Marcus didn't care. The twist cut deep, his savior a sinner, his victory tainted. But it sharpened his resolve. If even Brooks was complicit, no one was clean. The fight wasn't over. It was personal now. 2 days later, Marcus drove back to Millwood, the Georgia sky a bruised purple, storm clouds rolling in. Route 17 stretched before him, the same cursed strip where Boone's gun had pressed his chest, where Grayson's ambush had failed. His SUV hummed, patched from the shootout, a survivor like him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, a convoy snaked. Pickup trucks, sedans, vans, hundreds of black men and women from the town, their horns a defiant chorus. Evelyn Carter rode shotgun in the lead truck, her scarf fluttering. Malik manned a megaphone, his voice a clarion. "We ride together." They stopped at mile marker 17.3, the gravel shoulder a battlefield turned shrine. The crowd spilled out, old men with canes, mothers with kids, teens with fists raised, 500 strong, a wall of unity against the dusk. Marcus stepped from his SUV, his jacket torn but his stance unbroken, and faced them. The air thrummed, alive with their presence, their pain, their power. He took the megaphone from Malik, his voice steady, cutting through the wind. "Justice isn't a gift," he said, words ringing out, a soldier's command and a preacher's fire. "It's a war we win together. They won't give it, won't bend, won't break, unless we make them. I've fought for this country, bled for it, buried men for it. But it's not theirs, it's ours, and we take it back." Cheers erupted, a roar that shook the trees, fists punching the sky. Evelyn gripped his arm, tears streaming, but her face was steel. "You're right," she shouted, voice raw. "We're done waiting." Marcus looked out, seeing Jamal in their faces, his father in their scars, Darius in their resolve. Brooks's betrayal burned fresh. I contained it, a reminder that even allies could wield the same knife. "They'll come for us," he continued, voice dropping, a warning. "Grayson's gone, Boone's broken, but the system's still here, bigger, older, meaner. It's in the badges, the courts, the silence. But we're bigger too, stronger, louder, alive." He paused, letting it sink in. "We don't ask anymore. We build, our watch, our rules, our fight." The crowd surged, a tide of agreement, James Hill nodding, Tasha Green clutching her son, Malik pumping his fist. They'd trained under Marcus, spotting tails, dodging traps, standing firm. A militia of necessity, not hate. The feds watched from afar, Hensley's SUV parked a mile back. But Marcus didn't care. This wasn't their story. It was Millwood's, a town waking up, a people claiming what was theirs. "Justice is a war," he repeated, voice a vow. "And we're the army. Together we win, or we die trying." Rain began to fall, soft at first, then hard, soaking their clothes, their signs, their skin. They didn't scatter, stood taller, a forest unbowed. Marcus handed the megaphone back, stepping into the crowd, shaking hands, meeting eyes. Evelyn hugged him, whispering, "Terrence would have followed you." He nodded, throat tight. "He's here," he said, and she smiled, a ghost of peace. The convoy rolled out, a slow march back to town, headlights cutting the dark, a symbol of solidarity, a promise of more. Marcus drove last, the road blurring through the rain, his mind clear. Justice wasn't a courtroom win, a badge reformed, a general shamed. It was this: people united, refusing to kneel. Power wasn't theirs to grant, it was his to take, theirs to hold. The message sank deep, a truth forged in blood and gravel. The war wasn't won, but it was waged, and that was enough. For now. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving Millwood damp and quiet, the protests simmering into plans, meetings, patrols, a community arming itself with will, not just weapons. Marcus drove alone, the SUV crunching over wet leaves, to a small cemetery on the town's edge. He parked, stepping out into the mist, his boots sinking into soft earth. Before him stood Jamal Carter's grave, a simple stone weathered by time. Jamal T. Carter, 1971-1990, loved forever. Weeds crept around it, but a fresh flower, Evelyn's touch, rested against the base. Marcus knelt, his hand brushing the stone, the cold seeping into his fingers. "Hey, brother," he said, voice low, a whisper between them. "I made it this far. You didn't, but I'm carrying you." He saw Jamal's grin, his sketches, the way he'd laughed at Marcus's drills. "You're gonna march me to death, man." And the ache hit, sharp and old. "They took you," he said, "but they won't take us. This is just the start, I promise." He stood, Glock heavy at his hip, the town a murmur in the distance. The fight loomed, Grayson's allies, the system's claws, a war without end. Brooks's fall was a win, but a small one. The machine churned on, spitting out new Boones, new Graysons. Marcus could keep going, train Millwood, lead the charge, tear it down brick by brick. Or he could rest, step back, let the young ones rise. Malik, Tasha, a generation fiercer than his. The choice hung there, unspoken, a question he didn't answer. He looked at the grave, then the horizon, the mist curling like smoke over a battlefield. "This is just the start," he repeated, a vow to Jamal, to himself, to the hundreds who'd marched. The SUV's engine rumbled as he climbed in, the road stretching both ways, back to town, forward to nowhere. He drove, direction unclear, the stone fading in his mirror. Readers would wonder, would he fight on, relentless, a soldier to the end? Or would he pause, trusting the fire he'd lit to burn without him? The answer wasn't given, only the man, the grave, and the war still raging. A story closed but never finished.